Britain deserves better.
I tell you what, I'll deal with my backbenchers, you deal with yours. I have to say to the right honourable gentleman.
Mr. Ellis, you were apologising to me yesterday for losing your cool. You shouldn't be a recidivist. And I want to hear the Prime Minister, even if you don't. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me say to the right honourable gentleman, there are two problems with the approach he's taking. The first problem is he can't actually tell us whether he's in favour of this treaty or against it. Look, we're clear. We're not signing it. We don't agree it. That's why we vetoed it being within the EU treaties, right? That is our position. What is his position? He's had all of Christmas. He's had all of his Christmas to make up his mind whether he'd sign this treaty or not. Now, last night, this is very important. Very important. Let me explain. Last night, at the meeting of the European Council, every European country had to say whether it was going to sign up to this treaty or not. Britain and the Czech Republic said we wouldn't. So everyone has to make a decision. He cannot make a decision. He's had 53 days to make up his mind. Now, his second problem is this. He keeps saying this is an EU treaty. It is not an EU treaty. There was a Treaty of Maastricht, there was a Treaty of Nice, there was a Treaty of Amsterdam, there was a Treaty of Lisbon. On each occasion, the party opposite was in favour. There will be no EU Treaty of Brussels because we vetoed it. No. He asked me specifically what effect this treaty could have on the EU single market. And I think we should be clear that the treaty is clear. In Article 2, the provisions of this treaty shall imply only insofar...
The House must now calm itself. All that gesticulation and hand-waving from the Shadow Chancellor, anybody would have thought that... I thought the right honourable gentleman was playing with his cooking utensils. But I want to hear... Well, he's pointing somewhere, but I do genuinely, and I think the House and the country will want to hear the Prime Minister, as I hope they also wanted to hear the Leader of the Opposition. Let's hear the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think we know why the benches opposite are so depleted. They've been eating his lasagna, and they're all recovering. The point is, it's absolutely clear in Article 2, it says it shall not encroach upon the competences of the Union to act in the area of economic union. The fact is, Labour always fail to stand up for Britain. That is what we know. They gave away the EU rebate. What did they get in return? Nothing. They signed up to the bailout mechanism. What did they get in return? Nothing. They signed up to the social chapter. What did we get for that? Nothing. They opposed our referendum lock, and even now they are telling us that, according to them, Brussels doesn't have too much power, and if he was Prime Minister for long enough, he'd join the single currency. He's had 53 days to make up his mind whether he wants to sign this treaty or not. As usual, he can't make up his mind whether he's muddled or weak. The fact is, he's both.
Order. There's enormous interest. I'm keen to accommodate it. What is required is brevity, of which the Right Honourable and Learned Member for North East Fife is a past master. Sir Mingus Campbell.
We'll see if your prediction's justified, Mr. Speaker. May I begin by praising the pragmatism of the Prime Minister, although I confess to being somewhat surprised that my support for that pragmatism isn't shared throughout the government benches. But what is especially welcome is the fact that over the weekend he pursued a policy of re-engagement with our European partners, which is essential to his long-term objectives of the promotion of growth and the extension of the single market.
My right honourable friend is entirely right. Look, we have to ask a simple question. What is in the interests of the UK? It's in our interest to let the Eurozone get on with the job of sorting out their problems. It's in our interest to make sure this new treaty is restricted to the issues of fiscal union. And so it's in our interest to use leverage over the institutions and the legal issues to keep them focused on the fiscal union. That is the approach we've taken, and it's entirely right.
Mr. Jack Straw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every single article, bar one, of the treaty, which I've read, refers to institutions of the European Union, including the Commission and the Court of Justice. So, leaving aside its form, how can the Prime Minister possibly say that in substance this is not equivalent to a European Union treaty? And given the provisions of Article 12, which provide for the non-Euro members of contracting parties to participate in discussions about competitiveness, but not the people outside the treaty, what has been achieved by his veto, except that we're outside the door?
It's not an EU treaty because it doesn't amend EU law. It's not a treaty within all of the treaties of the EU. And that is very important because it would have been wrong to sign up for that without the safeguards to the single market and financial services and the other things that I set out. And let me just explain how important Article 2 is in this agreement of the other countries, because that explains absolutely, and let me read it in full, the provisions of this treaty shall apply insofar as they are compatible with the treaties on which the European Union is founded and with European Union law. They shall not encroach upon the competences of the Union to act in the area of economic union, i.e. this treaty is outside EU law. Why is it outside EU law? Because I made it outside EU law.
Mr. William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will know that the European Scrutiny Committee is making an inquiry into the nature and lawfulness of the agreement, otherwise known as this non-EU treaty. Will my right honourable friend accept that the problem we have in European policy making is it is on a slippery slope towards a more coercive, a more federal and a less democratic Europe? And will he give us his assurance that never, whilst he is Prime Minister, will we fold this non-EU treaty into the treaties as a whole?
Well, to answer my honourable friend's second question first, obviously this treaty cannot be folded back into the EU without the agreement of every EU member state. Now, we didn't sign this treaty because we didn't get the safeguards that we want, and that position absolutely remains. I think he's right to make the point about the danger of a slippery slope that can be created by signing EU treaties and the use of the EU institutions. And the whole point is, because this isn't an EU treaty, because it's outside EU law, we're not in danger of that happening.
Mr. Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So basically, the Prime Minister was afraid that if he went to the European Court of Justice and asked the European Court of Justice whether the European Court of Justice should have power to adjudicate on the so-called non-EU treaty, he feared he'd lose. That's basically the sum and total of it, isn't it?
Let me explain, because I know the honourable gentleman takes great interest in European affairs. Let me explain again. The point is, it is in our interest that these Eurozone countries get on with the job they need to do. It's absolutely important that they stick to the fiscal union and don't encroach on the single market. Clearly, there are uses for the institutions they've set out in this treaty, some of which are legal, under existing EU law, some of which are highly questionable. Now, we are going to use that leverage and that legal position to make them stick to the position of sticking to the fiscal union. That is the most sensible thing to do, and I would have thought with all his experience in European politics, he'd understand that.
Mr. Richard Ottaway.
From the Prime Minister's confirmation that there is no provision in the treaty which allows the single market to be undermined. But he will be aware that the President of France has been driven to imposing a financial transaction tax on France alone. Will he agree that the dismay with which this was met by the financial services sector in Paris illustrates exactly why this is a bad idea?
Well, I think one doesn't need to look any further than the European Commission itself, which actually carried out an investigation into a financial transactions tax and found that it could cost £500,000 jobs in the European Union. That's why I think the whole idea of pursuing this at the moment is completely wrong. Of course, it'd be different if the whole world was going to accept a financial transactions tax, but that is extremely unlikely to happen. That's why I don't think it's the right approach. But let's be clear, in this country, we do get our financial services to make a proper contribution. For instance, we have stamp duty on share transactions, which actually raises considerably more than I think the French are planning to raise with their early foray into this area.
Mr. Dennis McShane.
Thank you. Can the Prime Minister confirm what I think the Chancellor said in the course of the last couple of days, that when more money is required by the IMF, Britain will not fall short?
Now, what the Chancellor said is that we're obviously founder members of the IMF, strong supporters of the IMF as an institution, but the IMF must always lend to countries, not to currencies, that we wouldn't be part of an EU bailout fund. We'd only take part, obviously, if other countries were coming forward as well, and it would only be after Eurozone countries and indeed Eurozone institutions had done what they need to stand up and support their currency. That's the position, and I think it's right.
Mr. Bernard Jenkin.
Can the Prime Minister say something about the nature of the EU that we're now a member of, where a subset of member states can bypass a veto, hijack the institutions for their own purposes, without the consent of the dissenting member state? And can I say that he's entirely right to maintain a reservation to make sure that that doesn't happen?
Now, I think that the point is this. There are organisations, as he knows, within the EU that use the European institutions, such as the Eurozone group, such as the Schengen group that we're not part of. The fact is, this treaty is outside the European Union treaties, which gives us that extra protection, plus the fact that we have the ability to exercise leverage to make sure they stick to fiscal union rather than get into the single market, which is what we want to protect. That is absolutely important, and that's the approach we should take.
Gisela Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Greek writer Aristophanes gave us the concept of Cloud Cuckoo Land. I wonder whether some of the European leaders visited that mythical country on Monday. Could the Prime Minister tell us how on earth he thinks a country like Greece will regain competitiveness if he can't devalue, which he can't within the euro?
I do think the Honourable Lady makes a very serious point, and when you actually read the agreement that these countries have come to, I completely understand the need for fiscal discipline within the Eurozone. Clearly, you can't have countries building up excessive deficits year after year, and one can understand the concern of Germany and also other northern countries about this. But when you look at the text of the treaty, it is actually very concerning that I think some countries will really struggle to meet it. And what we need in Europe is, yes, of course, arrangements for fiscal discipline, but above all, we do need arrangements for additional competitiveness, for opening up markets, for getting economies growing. That was the first half of the EU meeting, which we were large participants in, and very much driving that agenda that will help Greece, Spain, and other countries in the south of Europe.
Mr. Andrew Tyree.
The Eurozone crisis has now become a major global risk, but the member countries seem wholly incapable of addressing it properly and its root causes. Will the need for IMF intervention and direction of the crisis be discussed at the G20 summit that he'll be attending on the 25th of February, and was it discussed at the summit he's just come from?
There wasn't a discussion about IMF resources at the informal EU Council. I think, to be fair to Eurozone members, is what they need to do is difficult for countries to do. They need to contribute huge amounts of money to a firewall to prevent contagion. They need to put capital into their banks to strengthen them at this time of stress. They have to give up quite large areas of sovereignty to try and make sense of the Eurozone. These are all reasons why we stayed out of the Eurozone and why I believe we shouldn't join the single currency. But I think it's only fair to actually explain they have taken quite a few steps down that road. The argument I was making in Davos is that as well as the short-term things they need to do, they need a setup that makes sense for the long term of the Eurozone too.
Mike Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said he will watch closely and, if necessary, take action, including legal action, if our national interests are threatened by this treaty. Will that legal action be taken through the European Court of Justice? And how does that marry with his next statement that EU institutions should only act with the explicit authorisation of all member states? Will other states not allow that?
surprised. I don't think the honourable gentleman understands how these institutions work. The point is a very simple one, which is it is clearly in our national interest to maintain the single market at the level of the 27 to make it work for us. As long as this treaty is staying out of that area, focusing on fiscal union,